I'd like to welcome everybody back to our Nadit Share Screen Africa series, which has been titled Exploring Biodiversity and Climate Change to Enhance Teaching and Learning in Namibia. And this has been particularly tailored for the Nadit teachers in training who can then bring this awareness into their classrooms. This is the sixth and the final event of the series. For those of you that are new to the series, a little introduction to us. Share Screen Africa introduces experts in conservation from all over Africa to audiences through creating virtual classrooms by Zoom on topics that are of interest and value to them. And Nadit addresses relevant environmental issues through hands-on experiential learning, supporting the Namibian school curricula in a practical, learner-centered way. And now it's time for me to introduce today's highly inspiring expert. Mia Kabajani is a dynamic vegetation ecology with over a decade of experience, passionately transforming forests, rehabilitating minds, and engaging with communities, turning research into action, mentorship into movement, and lectures into lively adventures in conservation. She has an MSc in Natural Resource Management with a research focus on forest regeneration ecology, a subject very close to my heart too, and which formed a big part of my university studies. As I mentioned to Mia, we haven't had a chance as yet, but I'd love to follow this up with a good chat about forest regeneration. So we're going to take up that opportunity, Mia, later. Now, Mia's going to give us a talk that's titled Forest Resources in Namibia, an overview of the values, threats, and management opportunities. Mia, the stage is all yours. You're welcome.
Thank you, Kirsten. And good afternoon to everyone. I see my friend Rusa just joined. Hi, Rusa. So I will be speaking today about forest resources in Namibia. And I was just saying earlier about how it felt like it's such a long time ago when I was approached by Nadit and Share Screen to give a talk on forestry. And I had to come up with a topic of what I can cover in that, because sometimes it becomes difficult to narrow down to a subject and find something you can speak on within 30 to 40 minutes. So I narrowed it down to looking at an overview of the values, threats, and management opportunities for forest resources in Namibia. So what can you expect to hear about in today's talk? I will speak on Namibia's vegetation zones, briefly focusing on the forest areas of the Northeast. I will look at factors that influence forest resource distribution in the country, a description of Namibia's forest resources, the value of forest resources, examples of these values, the threats to forest resources, and opportunities to protect or manage forest resources. And the brief I got from Share Screen was that to try and make the talk as simple as possible and understandable to even the person that is not an ecologist, so that it can be transferable to school kids and so forth. So I try to keep it as simple as possible without making it too scientific, so that it's basic and understandable to everyone. So first things first, we can start off with defining a forest. So according to the FAO, a forest is land that covers more than 0.5 hectares with trees that are more than 5 meters tall and a canopy cover of more than 10%. So that is what the Food and Agricultural Organization defines as a forest. In Namibia, however, we have another definition that we work with, because if we use the FAO definition, we have a very small area of forests in the country. And if we use the other definition that we have in Namibia, which talks about having 75% vegetation cover, then we have large areas of forests. And whenever I talk about forests, there's a funny story about a few years ago when we were doing summer school, and we had a lady from Central Africa give us a guest lecture. And so she said when she was invited to go to the forests in Namibia, they took her to Kavango and Zambezi, and so she was waiting to see the forest, but she couldn't see it. And they told her, "Oh, this is our forest." And she stood there and she says, "Oh, this looks like my mother's backyard plantation, and this is what you guys call a forest." So I always feel like that is the best we have to offer. And so it's important that we take that into account and manage that best, because we can't compare to Central African forests. But yeah. So our vegetation zones in Namibia, the map shows the vegetation zones as described by Geese in 1971. This was probably the most comprehensive vegetation map we had in the country. There are ongoing studies. Several people are doing updates and sort of describing these zones in more detail and breaking them down. But this has been widely used for years, for decades, I can say so. So the dark green in the northeastern part, that's forests, savanna, and woodlands. So that's where we find our forests, as we choose to call them. So as most of us would know, Namibia is the driest country south of the Sahara, and our forests form the southern edge of the Southern African forest biome. So what people call the Miombo woodlands, we are sort of on the very southern edge, if not out of that southern edge of the Miombo woodlands and so on. So we kind of just have the remnants of those of that forest biome. And our vegetation zones and structures vary across the entire country. And I always refer it back to the line in our national anthem, which says, "Contrasting beautiful Namibia." So we have a very diverse distribution of vegetation zones. So what are the factors that influence forest distribution in the country? The biggest and most influencing factor is rainfall. Of course, being an arid, dry country, rainfall plays a significant role in the distribution of vegetation patterns. And so if you look at the map on the right, our rainfall patterns, the rainfall is highest up here in the northeast, and it becomes less as you go south and west. So the further north and further east you go, the more rainfall you get. So this being the northeastern part of the country seems to have the highest amount of rainfall, above 600 millimeters annual average. So that's where you find the forests that we will discuss today. And then the second factor that influences forest distribution is topography. And so we have very diverse landscapes and habitats across the country, mountainous areas, desert landscapes, plateaus. So those influence the types of vegetations that grow in the different areas. And then thirdly, the geology and soils, because for different plant species require different soil types or geological formations to grow. So the diversity of geological formations and soils across the country influence the distribution of plant species across the country. And then frost and cold weather also play a role in that. So you find that the species that grow mostly in the woodland areas of the northeast, you will not find them in the southern parts of the country, because that is more a winter rainfall area. It's cold, and there's a lot of frost, and they are not frost resistant, so they cannot survive in those areas. So just a brief description of Namibia's forest resources is that our forests, regardless of the definition, they are important, and we need to manage and protect them. And our local trees are generally slow growing, and regeneration is often poor due to natural or anthropogenic factors. So there are various factors that influence the regeneration or recruitment of trees into the forest systems. Things such as fire, grazing, water, proximity to settlements has an influence, because the frequency at which the plants are harvested is influenced by the proximity to settlements and the need for those plants. And then the vegetation is further threatened by various factors as well. Some are generic and some are specific to certain species. So for example, with kiat, you have a situation where this plant would germinate, grow to a certain height, and if an intense fire comes through, that particular seedling will die out and go into a sephartic stage, a stage of you don't see any growth on the surface. Then it waits for the next growing season, and then it comes up again. And it does that for plus minus 10 years until conditions are perfect for it to shoot up, and then it will eventually grow past a meter, and then it finally grows out into a tree. So that amount of time influences the recruitment of that particular species into the system. And then the threats can, however, be addressed through approaches like inventories, control methods, and research. So these are just some of the tools that can be used to manage or deal with the threats that, that come towards forest resources. And then the species composition of the northeastern woodlands, and as mentioned, it's mostly influenced by the rainfall patterns and the soil types. The northeastern part is characterized by deep Kalahari sands. So the plants that grow there tend to be very, how do you call it? So, sort of they prefer that type of growth media. So they do well in that. And it's characterized by Fabaceae and Caesalpinioides species. So this is sort of like the family of plants that you mostly find in there. And the table that is here just shows, just summarizes some of the most common species that you find in the area. So we have things like Berkia, which is the wild syringa or the sand syring, the Zambezi teak, kiat, the mangeti, usivi, and the Kalahari portberry. So those are just some of the more common species that you find in the northeastern woodlands. And then we'll go through the value of forest resources. So forest resources have variable, different values that they provide. And so I will discuss 4 of them. So you have the provision of cultural services. So these are services from the environment that help to enrich the lives of people. And we can so basically consider this as just the fact that a forest exists. It's valuable because of the spiritual value that comes of it, the aesthetic value, the educational value, the recreational value, the sense of place, or the cultural heritage. So a lot of rural communities have cultural values placed on the forests that they reside in. Then we have regulating services. So these are services that result from the regulation of ecosystem processes and the environment. So it's sort of like the forest now acting almost like a machine that provides climate regulation services, carbon sequestration, flood regulation, water purification, pollination. These are functions that simply just occur because a forest is there. And if we remove that, we reduce the functionality of that area in terms of all these functions that have been listed here. Then we have provisioning services. These are services in the form of products that are collected from the ecosystem. So these are things that we can harvest from the forest. So things like food, fruits, tubers, honey, fresh water based on the water purification from regulating services, things like fuel or firewood, building materials, those are all provisioning services. And then we end off with supporting services, which include things like biomass provision, habitat, nutrient cycling, and soil formation. So these are all other aspects of forest functions that sort of provide more services based on the resources that we have in the forest. And then just a brief example of some forest resource values. So in Namibia, for example, some of the most common uses boil down to timber, And if you look at the pictures that are under the timber section, our forests tend to have almost very similar sized plants. And this boils down to utilization. So in some areas, the utilization has been to a point where the trees are now only small diameter sizes. And so you have very little in terms of legal timber sizes to work with, but that still happens. And then you have things like fruits. So these are just examples of fruits that are provided through forest resources. And then we have non-timber forest products. So these are things like thatching grass. At the bottom here, we have palms. So those are valuable. They occur in the forest areas, but they are not timber, they are not fruits, but they are still resources that come out of the forest, and they are very useful to communities. So then we'll look at the threats to forest resources. Now, I've broken this down into, I think it's about 5 key considerations, which I will just highlight on. So the first one being institutional. So by institutional, I refer to things like resources and organizational support. So this is the availability of resources for institutions to do monitoring, to do inventories. So those are limited, and the staff that is required, Namibia is a large country, so you would obviously need a huge support system in order to do inventories and document what is on the ground. And that seems to be a limited resource. And then organizational support, there are not many institutions that come forward and say, we will take this from you and do that on behalf of, say, the forestry department to support them in their roles. So that is one of the key threats that we can look at when we look at forest resources. Then the second one is the socio-economic aspect, which I refer to utilization, and I included fires in that. So by utilization, if you look at the graph below here, which shows minimum volumes of timber harvested, and that's from 1959 and then all the way to 2018. So look at the figure that is at 2018, that's about 30,000 cubic meters of timber harvested. The other years have no figures, either due to harvesting moratoriums that were imposed or to insufficient data being available. So that just shows that there has been an increase in the amount of timber that is harvested within the forest resources of the country, and which becomes a big threat because if we consider, back to the description, the fact that these trees are slow growing. On average, it would take up to about 65 years for a kiat to grow to the legal 45 centimeter harvest limit for timber. And then fire becomes a critical aspect in this because we're looking at communities that use fire as a management tool. So when it's time to prepare crop fields for farming, they use fire, and you get a lot of what we can call runaway fires, and that burns down a lot more than what was supposed to be burned down. So if you look at the picture in the middle, that's a tree that has sort of over time been burnt down. So that in a way also reduces the quality of the timber that can be harvested from the resource. So that becomes another major threat. Then the third one is the environmental or natural aspect of rainfall or drought and climate change. We have very erratic or unpredictable rainfall patterns in the country. Droughts play a role in recruitment of plants into the system. So if you have a few years of continued drought, you'll find that your recruitment becomes less. And if the recruitment becomes less, that means you have very few individual plants coming back into the system. And if you're harvesting, that means your resource is becoming less because your recruitment is low. And we are at a high risk of climate change impacts. So if temperatures rise to higher than the levels that we're used to now, we will be in situations where we either have extreme floods or extreme droughts, which both have the potential to negatively impact the forest resources. And then we look at the technical aspect as a threat. So this I used to refer to limited data and studies. And so once again, the limited availability of information on the resource becomes a threat because we do not know or understand what we're trying to manage. So that in itself is a threat because as we saw with the previous graph, there are some years that had gaps, and that was due to the unavailability of data. So you cannot fully document trends if you do not have data available for that. And then lastly, on the threats is policy and governance. This I used to refer to regulation and control. And as I mentioned in the earlier point, so when you look at regulation and control, you need human resources. And if the human resources are limited, then that means control is also limited. So the picture on the left is an example of what happens with illegal harvesting camps. So people basically set up camps in very isolated places. They harvest, they process their timber, load and go. And because the forestry officials do not have that much in terms of resources of vehicles and so forth to reach those isolated locations and do checkups in those areas, they miss those things. So that becomes a major threat because there's a lot of illegal timber harvesting that is happening behind the scenes, and people are unaware of it because they cannot access the areas. So what are the opportunities that we can have or use to protect forest resources in the country? So I've listed a few. So one of them is creating awareness of sustainable forest management practices and its potential, especially for local communities. So awareness creation is something that I think still needs to be really improved on or intensified in the country if we are to create awareness of what is happening out there with our resources, what is available, and what is going on. Then secondly, involving locals in activities aimed at quantifying and understanding forest resources. This refers to involving the rural local communities that actually live in areas where these resources exist, because it's a bit defeating to the purpose to have scientists come in, do all these studies, and then they walk out, but the locals don't really understand what are these people doing here? Why are they here? Because at the end of the day, the locals also have information that they could contribute, that they could share with the people that are coming in. And then adequate training for law enforcement officers, and that links to that, controlling harvests. So the law enforcement officers, to equip them with skills that can help them to investigate and keep track of the resources on the ground. Because sometimes you get situations of people have a permit for something and they can just say, oh no, I got the permit, and we can just go through. So to really equip the officers with investigative skills that they can really get to the bottom of issues and say, where did this originate from? Where is it headed to? Is it legally harvested? And so that is that would be a key tool in managing resources. and then necessitating certification of forest resource use. So this might be a bit far-fetched, but even if it's just creating a local system where we can say, for example, when it comes, let's use the charcoal industry as an example. You need FSC certification to be able to export to certain countries. So to have a certain type of certification required for timber harvesting, for timber transportation, for resource use, it would add, it would be a bit more admin, but it would provide a certain level of control that would be better in managing the resources. Then the development of forest management plans and fire management plans. These are important, and we see a lot of these in community forests and conservancies. They develop the forest management plans, wildlife use management plans, fire management plans, but it's something that we do not have for local communities. So communities can be assisted in developing basic forest management plans where they can use something as basic as a tally system and say, oh, in this piece of land, we have how many of this type of trees, and oh, how many can we take out, and how many can we plant back? So stuff like that becomes important in creating management, but it also gives the communities a sense of ownership and accountability towards the resources within their areas. And then lastly, an introduction and implementation of silvicultural initiatives. So just to work on encouraging tree planting initiatives in schools, in communities, research that supports this, and to roll it out to grassroots levels, that would be a great help. And then, oh, I said lastly, but okay. And lastly, developing value chains for forest resources. We have the resources, but a lot of them, there has been not much in terms of value addition developed to create incentives for people to generate income from these resources. So these are some of the ideas we could use in order to manage our resources better. And so at the end of it all, I feel managing forests should be viewed as a collective responsibility. And the question comes back to each one of us: how do you think you can contribute to this? And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. The bibliography is just some of the resources I used, and it's resources that really summarize the forest resource management in Namibia and the status quo of forest resources in the country. So those would be interesting materials to look at. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and your time.
So thank you very much, Mia. Round of applause. That was fantastic. Mia, that last question that you had on your second last slide, the question that you were asking of the audience, can you just repeat that question to us?
The question is
something about how can you contribute?
How can you contribute towards forest management?
Yes, so that's a very good question
in your role, on a personal
Exactly.
level, in your professional capacity, and so forth.
Yeah.
So it becomes a collective responsibility for all of us.
Super. Well, I think that question is great, and that we can all take that home with us and reflect on it. Very valuable. And I just wanted to say that that you really are quite a rare, you have a rare quality of both being a great scientist and researcher, as well as really being active on the ground level, engaging with communities and the work that you're doing. So I really appreciate that you have brought that balance. I'm going to start off with a question, and then we can open it up to the floor. What I wanted to ask you was, obviously there's a huge amount of pressure on many of these timber tree species. Have you, did your research cover as well how to, what one can do to support those populations of tree species, how one can manage them in a way that actually helps them to thrive again?
So with my research that I did for my master's, I looked at natural regeneration or the natural recruitment of valuable species. So, and one of the things that we looked at was the possibility of propagating these species. And so we worked on sort of, it was a project with several subsections. And so one of them I looked at the natural system, and then somebody else looked at the propagation of some of those valuable species and planting in the natural systems and seeing how they grow over time. So, and considering the rate at which these plants grow, I think that is still ongoing work where on an annual basis you have to check and see, oh, how tall has that particular plant grown? Is it still growing? Has it been burnt down, or has it been pulled out or something? So at this point, I think one of the key things we can do is to really look at opportunities for supporting the recruitment system, because that seems to be one of the things that is very affected by both natural and human-induced factors. So if we can work on the recruitment, then that means we have an influx of new plants coming in, and then we work on managing the factors that threaten these plants as they grow, and we manage those, and we would be in a position to sort of create a growing population of valuable timber species.
Thanks, Mia. Okay, just one little comment in the chat from Saddam Kalumba. He says, well presented. And Krista de Alton says, thank you, Mia. Informative and interesting as always. And I've got a question from Rusa. Rusa, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Mia?
Sure. Hi, Mia. Thanks for the talk.
Hi, Rusa.
You're welcome. I was wondering, you mentioned, or you touched a bit on something that relates to land use planning. So you said there are communities that would chop down trees for use. So for example, building their houses and so forth. Are you aware of any ongoing or proposed changes to Namibia's forest policies, for example? Because I know some of them are quite outdated and don't really reflect the situation on the ground now. And then that also relates to issues such as integrated land use planning and management plans. So in terms of governance and policies, what measures are in place to cater to that? Because as you know, even though you do all the research, if you don't have those measures in place, there's nothing that enforces. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So in terms of legislation and policies, we have the Forest Act as one of the key guiding pieces of legislation for the country. And I know that that is currently under review. And so I'm not sure how far that review is now in terms of progress, but I know that there was proposals to review that and to link aspects of land use planning and forest resource management and incorporate those in. And so that is in progress. But the other thing that has happened is, I can't put a date to it, but the Department of Forestry, which used to be under the Ministry of Agriculture, Water, and Forestry, has now been placed back into the Ministry of Environment, Forestry, and Tourism. So that allows for the management of the forest resources and the wildlife resources to be under one umbrella and managed together, because it becomes a bit difficult when you try to manage the forest resources away from the, from the wildlife resources, because they are so intertwined. So those are some of the legislative and policy changes that I am aware of. And I think you also referred to sort of land use planning for communities or in the communal areas. That is something that I know a lot of the regional councils are working on to help communities develop land use plans for the different regions. And I haven't really had a look at the details of those documents, but hopefully it includes the forest resources and how those can be best managed. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Rusa. Great. So yeah, the floor is open for any questions. I'm just looking at the chat and I don't see any there. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, here we go. Gail, wonderful. Go ahead, Gail.
It's actually, it's not Gail. I just joined using her link.
Oh,
It's
right.
trendy.
Okay, super. Well, welcome.
Thank you. All right. My question is on the timber harvesting situation. I'm from the Zambezi region, and I've also been a culprit of that in a sense of we can see that our communities don't really have the finances to build houses from bricks. They can only afford to build houses using timber. So in that case, do we have an alternative option for our communities? Because, well, we look at it as if they are misusing or overusing these resources, but actually that's what they can afford. So since their finances cannot allow them to build houses made of bricks, is there any alternative option for them to not overuse the timber?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So looking at rural communities, and that's one of the reasons why I touched on making sure that rural communities are involved in the development of management practices, because they are the end users of these resources and they live in these areas. So in situations where you have people that do not have the financial means to use other materials for building, I mean, that is sort of the traditional way of life in Zambezi, in Kavango, in several other places where you use the resources available to you. The challenge becomes we are now at points where people harvest more than they need. So they would harvest, say, for example, the poles for the house, but instead of going specifically and said, I need 6 poles for my house, they go and harvest 8 or 10 poles. And sometimes they can see this particular pole is not a quality that I can actually use for my house. They bring it down and then it's left lying there. So that now becomes a bit of wastage. So having an idea of saying what is the best material for me to use is important. And this is where indigenous knowledge comes in. So people that know and understand what is the best material that we can use and that would last long, so that we are not unnecessarily harvesting resources that we will need to replace in 1 year. And that becomes a thing of you have to replace every year. So choosing the best quality of the resources that you have, use that. And then in terms of looking at alternatives for them to work with, it's it's a bit challenging to say use, let's say, prefab, because that still requires finances. So people can still use the natural resources available within their areas, but they just need to be cautious of choosing the right material for the right purpose, and then in a way be made aware of the fact that they can contribute to, say, I take out one, let me put back two. So that idea of tree planting and replacing what you have taken out is a key and very basic approach that people can use at grassroots level without necessarily giving up their traditional way of building homes. They can still build their homes, but do it in a very manageable way, in a way that they can handle the resources well and contribute to the replenishment of those resources. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm assuming.
Sorry, yes.
Yes. Okay, fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so and I see that my colleague, actually, Dr. Stella Malanga, has got a question. So Stella, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Mia, thank you so much. It was a beautiful presentation. And as a vet, it was my first time learning about forest and everything. And
yeah,
it was of interest to me. So my question is, my internet blocked a little bit when we were explaining about the community involvement. So I would like, if you have a successful story that happened maybe in a situation where the community was actively involved and in a positive way, would you please share? I would like just to hear more about community engagement in managing the forest.
Okay, so communities are, we have a very internationally acclaimed conservation program in Namibia. The CBNRM program is widely known. And so some of the areas do not necessarily have conservancies, they have community forests. And those have been sort of taking up momentum across the country. Some of them, let's say in the northwest of the country, they don't have the tall trees and so forth, but they have the shrubs where they get resin. So from the conifers, they get a resin, which can be used in the manufacturing of perfumes. So one of those community forests actually now has a processing facility in Opua where they harvest this resin. They buy the facility buys resin from community members, processes it into that liquid perfume. And I think last time I checked, they were exporting to a perfume company in France. So that's one. Another one that I also recently learned about is a community forest in Zambezi in the Skanjavka area. They started a community forestry project. They now have things like a nursery where they grow vegetables. They also grow indigenous plants. They have a brick making project. So the money that they generate from one aspect of the project, they use that and channel it into other income generating activities like making bricks and so forth. And with that, they've been able to actually do good things to a point where sometimes they even support tree planting initiatives for the local school. So those are just a couple of examples of communities taking the initiative and using that to do at a level within their means to contribute towards managing the resources and using that to generate income for other needs that they have in the community. And I think they've even bought a water pump for their community. Wow. So it's things like that, that they're not just waiting to be funded, but they're coming up with ways of funding and then getting initiatives. And through those initiatives, they lessen the pressure that they put on the forest resources by coming up with various alternatives within the community.
Thank you so much. Wow, I've learned a lot.
You're welcome.
So, you know, here in Malawi, there is a forest called Nzalanyama Forest. And a lot of people from that area, they have gone into like charcoal production. So up to the extent that now they're almost done with the forest and they're going into Mozambique because it's just in the boundaries with Mozambique. And now as both like the youth from LCA, we're trying to get into like a project to educate people about conservation in that area. But then we understand on the other hand is they're doing that because of poverty. They need like ways to spend their lives and everything. That's why I asked that question so that we can get to understand how the communities are getting engaged in the like to resist the forest, so that when we go, we can try to discuss other alternatives, what they can do and everything. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. So
Thanks, Mia. Great answer. And thanks, Stella. Great question. I would like to then turn to Saddam Kalumbu. He's got a very nice question. So Saddam asks, maybe you can emphasize on alien species and if they have any effects on the environment, so on the forest, I would imagine as well. And what are the conservation status in Namibia? So I think that's a really great question.
Okay. Alien species, that is actually one of the threats we have to vegetation in the country. We have, I think, with the distributed alien invasive species poster, I think it's about 48 or more alien plants in the country. A number of those are invasive. We have both aquatic and terrestrial invasive plants. So their threats are such that a lot of them tend to use up more water than the indigenous plants, which I think for a country like Namibia, that becomes a very notable thing because we already have limited water available. And so to have our indigenous plants competing against alien plants for water becomes a bigger threat. And so with the distribution of alien plants, depending on the areas, I'll give an example of areas like the Hardap and Omaheke regions. So along the ephemeral rivers there, we have prosopis. Prosopis was introduced as a fodder plant in the early 1900s. And it took over those areas to a point where along the ephemeral rivers, you do not have indigenous plants. It's only prosopis. So it then makes it challenging to say, let's clear this alien plant, because you can't. You now leave the banks of the river barren because that's the only thing that is there. So in that case, there's been that exception to say, we can try to control the shrub layer, but let's not take everything out because this thing, it now seems to have become a bit more natural. Then I will use a second example of Kariba weed, which was, it somehow found its way into the water systems of the Zambezi region. So on the Chove, on the Zambezi in the 80s. And it formed such thick mats that it made fishing difficult because it blocks out the light. So nothing else can photosynthesize under it because it has formed a layer above the water. So that now affects the livelihoods of the people. It has fortunately been put under control. They used biological control agents and they were able to control that. And so we have various species. Around Windhoek, you will find cactus. That is something that institutions or organizations like the Botanical Society, they're constantly creating awareness, constantly coming up with cleanup campaigns to help get rid of cactus within those areas. So those are just a few examples and some of the threats that they pose. And there was a second part to that question. I'm now trying to remember what it was.
Okay, so the last part, he says, what are the conservation status in Namibia?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the conservation status of trees, for example, it's the trees are protected under the Forestry Act, and there are species, quite a number of the timber species are protected, and you get other species, things like the Welwitschia, they are all protected under forest legislation. So their utilization has to be very controlled or regulated, which is why the equipping of forestry officials to be able to carry out this mandate is important, because they need to have an understanding of the conservation statuses and how best they can protect these species, and what are the management actions in place. So there are variable conservation statuses for the local plants through the Forestry Act. I hope that answers your question, Saddam.
Looks good.
Okay.
Stella, do you want to carry on?
Yes. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for that question, and it was a good one, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the chat, Kamuhelo says, great presentation, Mia. I have a contribution. So I will ask Kamuhelo Lisao. I'm sorry
Yes.
if I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly.
You have
Would
it
you
right.
please unmute and add your contribution? Would love to hear your contribution.
I'm sure it will be a valuable one.
Uh-huh.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, come on. Oh, okay. No, thank you very much for the nice presentation, Mia.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on for the threats that we currently have is prominent in Namibia. The one that was mentioned here, the alien species, that one seems to be becoming also quite a big problem, because at the moment, propagation of alien species is not really so much controlled. So as an effort for afforestation and reforestation, people tend to plant alien species because they are fast growing. And though they demand a lot of water, they are fast growing. And so people would easily grow that than the local indigenous species. So that has really become a problem, because alien species have spread, and especially within urban green microclimates, you mostly find the alien species, and meaning that most of our microclimate is currently being changed, because all our small things that would be using our local tree indigenous species as their habitat, they'll come and find maybe the leaves of these species are quite different from what we have, and then they are pushed further away and the population goes down. So there's a project that I'm currently involved in, which is being run by the University of Namibia, trying to promote indigenous tree planting. It's not easy, because people do not see the benefits as fast as they would with the indigenous species. But like you mentioned, awareness is quite important. So we need to keep on raising that awareness, to sensitize people, to also encourage tree planting, because it's not really a big culture in Namibia because of the dryness. There's already a shortage of water for the community members themselves. Now, to add on with the plant to water, it's quite a challenge, especially in the rural areas of the country. But with awareness, and if people start planting more indigenous tree, it becomes more sustainable, because they would be using less water, and they'll still maintaining the micro climatic conditions that are ideal for our own environment. I have a very small plantation, if I may call it like that. And last year we experienced frost, even in the northern part of the region where we don't normally get frost. Yeah. And what I was attempting to plant, the fruit trees, alien fruit trees that I planted there, they were destroyed by the frost, but my indigenous species, they are still there. They are a bit more resilient, because even if they are hit by the frost, the root establishment, the root structure and all that is a bit different. So they are kind of a bit resilient. And then the other thing, in addition to the threats that you mentioned, the expansion of bush encroachment. We normally think of it as being only in the central parts of the country. But sadly, this has spread to that little woodland that you mentioned. It has spread to those areas due to unsustainable usage of the savanna species, because there's no balance, there's no regulation in terms of guidelines, if I may put it like that, because we know communities need to use the resources, but what are the silvicultural practices that they have to use in order to maintain that open woodland savannas? Some of the areas that were open woodlands, as it is supposed to be, the open savanna woodland, it is supposed to be, they are so encroached at the moment that in some of those protected conservation areas, you even find animals being trapped in those bushes. So it kind of also degrades our broad-leaved woodlands that we really, that is already so limited. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for the contribution.
Thank you so much, Kamuhelo. That was so good. Yeah. And also, there is a hand from Simeon Nampala. Simeon, would you please unmute?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mia, for the presentation. It was very nice. A quick question. Maybe I joined a little bit late, but what is your take on the commercial activities such as charcoal business in Namibia, which is growing when it's come to the threats to the environment? Do you think this is well taken in terms of permits that you have mentioned in your presentation, or is something to be concerned? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So looking at charcoal, an interesting fact is that we are, I think, among the top 4 producers of charcoal in the world. Very interesting. But when we look at the value of it, is that most of the charcoal industry occurs within the central parts of the country, which is the area that is very highly encroached. So the motivation for that has been that people need to clear their land of the invasive plants, which are the indigenous invasives. So they use that to then make charcoal and they export. And one of the things that happens in the charcoal industry, as I mentioned, is FSC certification. For most of the companies to be able to export, they need to have certain certifications. And those certifications look at the social aspect. That includes the well-being of the employees, the environmental aspect, and the economic aspect. So that the charcoal industry is a bit regulated, and people tend to adhere to that regulation because of the fact that it's a livelihood where they generate income. So a lot of people are afraid to lose that ability of them being able to use their land to generate an income through charcoal. So there is that regulation. But of course, there's always a few of those that fall through the cracks that are not fully regulated or that are not fully compliant. We always we always have those, but it's something that it's an industry that is a bit controlled because of the nature of the trade that goes into the exporting of charcoal. So there is a bit of control in that. And I know I think Kamuhelo can also add on to that because she was in the forestry office in Ochvarongo. I know that the forestry officials tend to visit the charcoal farms a lot more actually to look at, are they really harvesting what they should be harvesting and using that for charcoal, or have they started using other things that they shouldn't be using? So I think that's an industry that is a bit regulated, and considering that it's being done to try and control bush encroachment, it's sort of still within the limits, but of course, a constant eye needs to be kept to make sure that we don't lose sight of it. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simeon. That was a good question. And thank you so much, Mia, for a good answer as well. All right. So I would like to ask the audience if there is any more questions. And I can see in the chat, there is a comment from Gail Thompson, but I know they said that she said that someone was using her account. Yeah, but she says many of these species are used as ornamentals. I think she's talking about the Aryan species. Yeah, is it?
Yeah,
Yes.
some of them are it's a lot of garden plants, but we have those that are now in the natural system and actually causing challenges there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. Reaching this point, if there is no more any question, then I think we have come to an end of the Nadit series. Thank you so much, Nadit, for coming, for asking for this, and we're looking forward to getting more of the requests from you guys and working together. And thank you so much, Mia, for the good presentation. It was a good ending. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a good evening to all of you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.